Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So continuing in our series as it relates to racism and Black Lives Matter and the stand for justice that we're called to as believers, Inna Allah ya'muru bil adl, in Surah An-Nahl, chapter number 16, verse number 90. The scholars identified this verse as the fundamental verse of Islamic law, of the divine law to create a healthy, wholesome society. And so the beginning of it, indeed, God commands to justice. And so that is our calling as believers. That's who we are and what we represent, and that's what we should stand for in any situation and in our community. So today we're going to talk about a very subtle effect that a lot of us realize we have, which is implicit bias. So if we start first to look at what bias is in and of itself, bias, it consists of attitudes, behaviors, and actions that are prejudiced in favor or against one person or group compared to another. And so many people would say, okay, racism is a form of bias. And it technically is from a academic definition standpoint. But in reality, racism is a political and economic system invented by Europeans hundreds of years ago as a means of justifying and empowering their colonial aspirations in Africa and America and India and elsewhere. And so they created this idea of races and there being a fundamental difference in entire biological and intellectual reality with different races. And so because at that time, it happened to have been that on Earth, Europeans were, in terms of certain technologies, were ahead of others, they pictured themselves as the superior race. And so that's where racism actually comes from. There's no actual record of written, instances of institutionalized or recognized racism as a problem in societies where people would just look at dark skin and say, okay, well, this is somebody who's weaker and not, capable and uncivilized, whereas someone with white skin, because if we look before the colonialist times, even when they say the Vandals, and the Vikings, and when we look at a lot of the different white European historical realities in their culture, a lot of that was uncivilized for a lot of time. And so that's where racism comes from. It was institutionalized to empower them and justify their colonial aspirations, particularly in dark skinned lands where people have dark skin. So we have something called explicit bias, which is where you knowingly believe in racism as a factually biological or sociological truth. And so you say and do things intentionally, meaning that white people are biologically and socially, civilizationally superior to Black people. That is explicit racist bias. So obviously, as Muslims, we know that that's wrong. Islam and science are both in complete agreement that the skin color of a person has nothing to do with anything other than that. And that is an amount of melanin that is in their skin, which makes it be darker than someone who has a lack of melanin, and then they have lighter skin. And it depends on that person's experiences and exposure to different outside settings that would give them the potential to be superior in intellectual or whatever ways, civilizational. So we can see that there were many pseudoscientific attempts from Europeans to somehow prove that, in fact, European white biology is superior. And so they tried to bring this, but there have been multiple well-established proper scientific reviews and refutations that show that that is all absolute nonsense, that your skin color has nothing to do with your IQ or your culture or your work ethic or your health or any other thing. Those things are all things that will come as a result of your experience and environment and so forth. So implicit bias is a form of bias that occurs automatically. It's unintentional, and it affects our judgments, decisions, and behaviors. It creates discrimination, and you don't realize that that's what you're doing. And so where does implicit bias come from? The implicit bias is the more you're exposed to stereotypes and attitudes that are racist, then the stronger you start to naturally on impulse make associations that are race-based. And so the dominant culture in America has always been defined by whiteness. And at the same time, if we look at our own history as Muslims, a lot of us aren't really looking carefully, because it's interesting how a lot of Muslims are readily aware. It's interesting how you'll find a Muslim who's well researched and well aware of the abusive, belligerent tactics of the European colonialism in the Muslim world. And they basically found themselves subject to belittling and a constant, dehumanization and the feeling of inferiority by these colonial Europeans. And so we see through this time that the Muslim community had strayed from Islam. There is a lack of knowledge of Islam. A lot of Muslims don't even know exactly what is Islam. And there is a lack of practice as a result of the lack of knowledge. And so this is all pretty much rooted, as many historians would suggest, in a lack of proper government or leadership or institutionalized culture or civilization. Muslims have, in the last 3 centuries, been going downhill. The leaders were more interested in their own pride and legacy and family dominance or legacy or power of their own, their wealth and their empire or their kingdom, rather than leading my people so that they can all grow and that we collectively become a better people through education and religious knowledge and understanding. That was not emphasized in the last few centuries under the Ottoman Empire. And so then the local groups had very small pockets of good Muslim leaders who were following Islam, and they didn't really carry much influence because of this downfall of the Muslim community, and then this colonial effort that took advantage of that by the Europeans. And so these Europeans influenced the Muslims with this desire to live up to Western greatness, because these Muslims are seeing these Europeans with sophisticated technology, seemingly well proper, the way they present themselves, this whole idea of being shaved and clean shaven, and just the outfit and the tie and the whole production, that many Muslims felt, oh, I have to live up to this greater society. And so as a result of this engineered concept of racism by the European colonialists, we see that this European greatness that Muslims were looking to live up to, and still a large amount of Muslims are still looking to live up to that Western greatness, that is tied to whiteness, as opposed obviously to blackness or dark-skinned. And so those things are all connected. We have to realize, we have to connect the dots as seekers of truth and knowledge and justice. So once we grasp these facts, then we have to realize that all of us, no matter what color our skin is, we are all prone to carry implicit racist biases. And thus we cannot free ourselves from these implicit biases without being deliberately mindful and surrounding ourselves with true friends who will call us on our bias. So let's look at some practical examples. Let's take a look at exactly in reality where we can notice that we think or that we're around somebody who's being implicitly racist and thus discriminating. So the discrimination is a result of often bias. It's a natural result of bias. It's not the only result. It's not the only thing that causes it, but it is definitely one of them. So if we associate negative actions to someone, someone's doing something bad. So if it comes in our mind, or we say that black guy did that, so now we're automatically relating the person's skin color to their bad behavior. And so usually, unless someone is actually investigating, trying to identify who someone was, you will almost never hear somebody say, when somebody did something bad, and say, yeah, so a white guy did this, the white guy, cut me off, but you'll see somebody say, oh, that black guy cut me off in the road. You see, so here is where we have an implicit bias, where we're looking at and feeling that that person's behavior has something to do with the color of their skin, which is absurd. But because we're all surrounded in a society built on racism, that feeling naturally comes up. I had a sister last year who basically was concerned about her daughter's friends. And she mentioned that she's hanging out with a black guy. Now, as a Muslim, obviously, I truly understand from a moral basis if she said she's hanging around with boys, because now here we're talking about the sin, or the potential sin, of being in a illicit relationship or illicit sexual behavior. And so that is natural. And that's why the Quran says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, don't even come close to fornication, meaning to avoid the circumstances which lead to it. So I would totally understand that. That's not bias at all. That's morally astute. But to say the black guy, which I'm fairly certain that if the guy was white, she wouldn't say she's hanging around with a white guy, right? And so the fact that the person is black, or even the fact that the person, has dreadlocks or his pants are sagging, none of that has anything to do with the moral reality of the person. There are many, many people who are much more morally sound and civilizationally and intellectually superior, who have black skin, a large flat nose, dreadlocks, pants sagging, baggy pants, than someone who is white skin, shaved face, clean, suit and tie. That doesn't, you can find many examples of people like that being very corrupt and evil and no good and problematic, and find these people very elevated in their morality and intellectual prowess. So it's just a fact of reality when we study it. On the other hand, I had years ago, this just blew my mind, that I was, consulted by a family that, it's not here in North Carolina, but in a different place, an Egyptian family, their dad, the father of the family, is actually on a board of a Islamic school. And, he's known to be a very practicing Muslim. And his son was in college. And his son was in his senior year, going to graduate college. And in his senior year, through MSA, he had met an African-American convert sister who was a very devout, practicing Muslim sister. And he brought it to his family that I'd really like to settle and marry this sister. So his family made every excuse under the sun that did not make any sense. And so this brother came to me and said, I really feel like my parents don't want me to marry this girl simply because she's black. And so then when I came to the parents, they had refined their situation to something that sounds Islamically culpable. And they said basically, well, she has a different culture than us. The thing is that maybe there's some innocence to it, but their son is born and raised in America. So he has a family heritage, and he is part of a family culture of Egyptian culture. But if this young man were put in Egypt, he would not be perceived as Egyptian. He'd be perceived as a foreigner because he's American, just like the girl who he's looking to marry. And they are both American. So at the end of the day, I've come to know many people who they don't want to marry a black person. And that is ridiculous. It's absolutely not a reason to see someone as beautiful because they have light skin. Interestingly enough, white girls here in America are all in a big hurry to tan their skin very heavily so that it will look dark, right? And it was something that I could not even fathom. When I first saw it, I had no idea. I was trying to understand the linguistics. I was living in Kuwait. Me and my wife went to a nice high quality mall one afternoon, and we saw Mahal Tabid. So it looks like, from an Arabic standpoint, a shop for whitening. So my natural thought is that this is a shop where you go and they do the teeth, get your teeth whitening. Come to find out that they're doing something to the skin to make it lighter. That they go in there and spend all this time and they do something to the skin to make it appear lighter. And I saw many Kuwaiti sisters, weirdly enough, they're wearing the niqab right here over the top of the nose. But this whole area is very white powdered right here. And I asked the brother, and he explained it to me that they want to look like a white girl. And I even found out that when one brother said, we all aspire to go marry a Syrian woman. And I was like, what makes Syrians so special? And he said, oh, that beautiful white skin. And I'm thinking, what is wrong with you people? And that's what it is. The British have come through there. This idea was implanted in them. They don't realize it. I was sitting down with a good friend of mine one time, and he's a nice, good brother, very well-intentioned. He's trying to convince me when I pointed out that his statement was racist. He's like, no, but you've seen those black people. If you drive in their neighborhoods, you see how they're all, loud and obnoxious and all of that. So I had to inform him that it has nothing to do with the color of the skin, because you can find white people and Puerto Rican people and others who are not black who live in a certain culture where people are loud, and that's their culture. And it doesn't mean that they're immoral unless they're saying mean things. But I've been around a lot of white people who are loud and say mean things. There's no shortage of those. We had a guy in the White House for 4 years. Even though he's a billionaire white guy wearing a suit, loud and obnoxious and filthy, foul-mouthed, right? So it had nothing to do with his skin color, but everything to do with his own mental and spiritual sicknesses. So here in Charlotte, I've become annoyed at the idea that we want to go to a place of low crime, and then people pick Harrisburg. But if you look, Harrisburg, it stands out in the whole metroplex of Charlotte-Mecklenburg as the most lowest, if not very insignificant, number of black people living there. And people don't, they're not intentionally doing, people aren't intentionally doing this, right? But that's how it is. As a matter of fact, in all of North Carolina, Harrisburg as a city was the most racist city. It had an entire city council with, like, I've been told by a Presbyterian minister over there, of people who are affiliated with the KKK up into like the 80s. It's like been very recent. And people think, well, I'm just going to a place where I think it's low crime or is a good school. There are good schools all over Charlotte. There are very good schools within a mile of very poor, poverty-based, what we call red lines, where black people have been historically oppressed from a real estate discrimination standpoint. And then you'll find inside of Uptown, which they have now, unfortunately, what do you call that? Gentrification, I think it is, where they, try to exclude those people in favor of a more affluent white community. So what is the solution? What are some solutions to this unfortunate problem that we all suffer from? And the first part of it is in the Quran. لا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة. Listen, I swear by the self-blaming, self-accounting soul. Mindfulness. We have to be constantly aware of our implicit bias, that there's no doubt it's there. We've all been conditioned in many different ways to look at dark-skinned people as having a problem as a result of their color of their skin. And we tend to look at white people as generally less threatening, more, I guess, smarter and more successful, more trustworthy, all of those things. So that's the beginning. Second is to make friends with Black people. And don't just make friends with Black people, genuinely get to know them and spend time with them. And as you build friendship, not in a weird way, awkward way, but just let them know that, I have come to realize that I have implicit racist bias because of living in this society my whole life and coming from a country that has been affected by it. So just let me know if you ever feel like anything I said, like you're around some Black person and you're like, okay, so now we're going to eat fried chicken, like every Black person eats fried chicken, and, you never know. You may be dealing with someone that likes sushi. He's Black. He doesn't like fried chicken, so just empower your friends. Um, Similarly, when looking at someone, look at them as an individual with their own unique experiences, their own unique environmental conditioning, and just look at them through that. That's a person. That person has these issues. So, for example, I have old friends from before I was a Muslim who were very. I had a friend. I'm not gonna say his name. May God guide him. He had very white skin, red hair. He used to shave it because he was embarrassed about it. But this guy, you know, all kinds of crooked, backward, shady, everything. And we used to have friends that were Black and Latino. And if we were to ever get in trouble, he would be the least one in danger and the whitest of skin. And similar, I found it with my own self. So we have to judge people by their circumstances. It's not the color of their skin that has anything to do with their behavior. It is their own environment and circumstance. And then we have to think, did they choose that, or was that something that they were born into? You see what I'm saying? And so then you can have empathy and respect someone's situation and realize your own privilege. Recognizing privilege is very important to dealing with racism. So beware of the following subsets, right? There are subsets to bias. So there's the affinity bias, and this is also called the similarity bias. It's a tendency of people to have connections and want to be connected with people who are similar to them, same culture, same interests, same experience, same background. This is tribalism, and this is the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "Da'uha fa'innaha muntina." Leave tribalism because it's filthy and putrid. It is an affront to the Quran's call for the value of humanity. جَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا. That God says in the Quran, in the 49th chapter, verse number 13, I have made you into different tribes and nations so that you may come to know one another, that you will come to learn from each other, and that you will share experience and you will grow in your humanity through experiences, someone's different experience and background. So that's the first thing. Be careful about that. Next one is what we call confirmation bias. And that is the inclination to draw conclusions about a situation or a person that affirms your own personal beliefs, your prejudices, rather than merit of the situation alone. So confirmation bias is so common in so many different things. It's like, liberal, conservative, we're the Muslims and those are this, the Americans. Don't think like that. Always be willing to learn something new. Always be willing to be wrong and admit that. Always respect the fact that the more people I know from different backgrounds, the better person I am as a result of that. So The last one is what we call conformity bias, and that's the tendency of people to act similarly to people around them, regardless of their own personal beliefs or idiosyncrasies. We call this peer pressure. So you find yourself around people who are talking and acting racist, and you go along with it. Worst case scenario, you start talking and acting in the same way. This is conformity bias. This is peer pressure. And then less worst case scenario, lesser worse, is that you don't do anything about it or say anything about it because you don't want to ruffle anybody's feathers. And a true believer and a true justice warrior is the one who is willing to call somebody out. That what you just said or what the way you're acting is quite racist. And like, what do you mean? Like, for example, when the sister said, my daughter, she's with this black guy. And I said, what does him being black have anything to do with the problem? And then she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you said he was a black guy. She said, no, I didn't. And I said, no, you did. And then another person in the gathering said, yeah, you said black. And I don't think that's right. So then I said, and then she said, no, that's not what I mean. And I said, well, it's not necessarily that you mean it. It's called implicit bias. And then she was looking at me like I was talking about calculus or trigonometry or something. So, it's just like we are all affected by racism. This is a Muslim family who have darker skin. They come from Asia, but they've become affluent. They're wealthy, and they live in a very wealthy environment. So then they want to fit in with this racist tendency around people. I mean, a lot of black folks find themselves in the situation where they grew up in a certain way, and then they change everything about the way they act because they've become educated and affluent, which is a great achievement. And obviously they can do that because they're human being and they can become that if they work for it, unless the circumstances of racism have become so restrictive to them, as it is for many here in America, that they can't find them. So when they become, now they feel like I have to fit in with people and talk and act like them in order to, and that only perpetuates the problem. So let's be who we are. And let's only change who we are because of the morality of it or the wisdom of the situation in trying to relate to somebody. But in terms of general companionship, it's not about wisdom. It's about just being yourself. It's about being comfortable with people. So may God guide us to that which is right and eradicate from us this implicit bias that we all find ourselves struggling with, and give us the means to stand up for justice and have the courage to fix this broken world that has been afflicted with the disease of racism. Jazakumullah khairan. Subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.